Okay, this, for people that don't believe me about following directions, is that two graduate students, one of them's getting ready to um, send in a publication. First one goes, "What are you doing?" The other one goes, "I have to make sure my paper complies with all the submission guidelines. All the titles, text, captions, and references need to be the right font, point size, and spacing. Every margin and line break must be at least 1/32 inch accurate." Well, this is a submission to a conference. Gross. What's the conference about? Creativity and engineering. Darn, my footnotes are not in sans serif. So, what I told people writing the papers, make sure that you follow the directions for the formatting. That this is something that you'll wind up running into a lot in science. These people have obviously run into this a lot in science. It's not an unusual thing where every submission to every different source has their own set of rules, and if you're going to submit something, resubmit something, you have to go through and reformat it. Not necessarily the whole thing, but a lot. Okay. They said, for some reason, my microphone was not working, and so this is a re-record of the chapter. But most of you will not even know that because you haven't looked at the chapter yet and don't realize it was up with no sound. They said somebody did finally tell me. I check a lot of them, but I don't check every single one for every little bit. We're going to start at the outside with the outer covering, which is called integument. So this is your covering, and it's got a lot of functions. It is, of course, mechanical protection, what they call mechanical protection. So, protection from trauma from the outside. In a tremendous number of animals, it is a water barrier. Both to keep water from coming in for things that live in fresh water. Remember, waterproofing is one of the things that you need if you're a large animal in fresh water, or your cells are gonna flood and pop. But also for us land animals, it's a good water barrier to keep most of our water from leaving. And in some animals in very dry environments, there's integument is a better water barrier. It actually turns out that you can kill a cockroach if you grab it and scrape it with some sandpaper and then let it go. That it has a waterproof covering over its exoskeleton that you've just compromised, and it will eventually dry to death if you do that. At least I've never tested that. Somebody told me that years ago, but it was a specialist in insects, so I assume he's right. It is a regulation surface. It regulates water movement in some cases. It regulates temperature in some cases. In some, it can regulate waste removal. That's a fairly rare one, but that does happen. It is a sensory interface with the world. So a tremendous number of senses are embedded in the integument. It's an exchange surface. So not just waste removal, but also oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange in some animals, not in us. Is that the old thing about if we completely painted you and covered your skin, you would die from oxygen deprivation? It's not true. It wouldn't be good for you, but I'm not entirely sure. Depends on what's in the paint, I suppose. I mean, considering what they cover people with for movies now, covering your skin with something that doesn't essentially breathe, it doesn't seem to be a big deal. It is a covering that may allow you to blend into the world. So camouflage can be an important function of integument. Also, the opposite of camouflage, what they call display, making yourself show up. It could be display for potential mates. In that case, you better be either displaying in a way where potential predators don't see you, or as happens in male birds, you can display and your predators can't catch you anyway. It's like, I'm a bright red cardinal, look at me. Ha, you can't catch me. There's a lot of displays, not just skin cover displays that work that way. There are also displays that say, I want to stand out from the environment because I want you to realize you don't want to mess with me. What they call warning displays, warning colors, high contrast warning colors. Since a lot of predators don't see colors, that a lot of warning displays are contrast, white and black, yellow and black, red and black. But if you can't see colors, you still see the high contrast markings of a bee, or a millipede, or a skunk, or a coral snake, or an arrow poison frog. Lots and lots and lots of warning displays. And surfaces are also used for communication, secretions like pheromones, so sex pheromones, and defense secretions sometimes. The arrow poison frogs, the reason you don't want to eat them is their skin produces a very toxic substance. And communication. So it's a fairly long list of what integuments do. As much as I hate it, the distinction of backboned and non-backboned just winds up being a very typical distinction in animal comparisons. We have a two-layer integument. We have a dermis covered by an epidermis. So that, of course, is where they came up with the terms. And then when people started to compare that to other animals that don't have backbones, they found out they only got the one layer. So they decided to call it epidermis, even though that means above the dermis, and there's no dermis. So if you know the Latin, it's going to be confusing. It's like interstitial, between the spaces. Aren't the spaces between, you know. But our epidermis is usually a layer of epithelial cells. It could be one layer, it could be multiple layers, but it's all the same type of cells. And they're very often over the epidermis in a lot of invertebrates is some sort of cuticle. Could be a shell, could be an exoskeleton, but some sort of covering above the living integument. Is the shell is not alive, an exoskeleton is not alive. We'll talk about exoskeletons a little bit later. In us, the dermis is where all the doodads are. Although your nerves may send feelers up through the epidermis, the main sensory nerves are in the dermis. The blood vessels are in the dermis. The connective tissue that holds everything down is in the dermis. Any kind of glands that are secreting onto the surface, the glands themselves are in the dermis. If we're producing hair or we're producing, feathers, scales, if you're a reptile, is it fish scales are epidermal, reptile scales are dermal, derived from two different layers. It always confused me when I was first learning about evolution and the evolution of vertebrates. And it went fish, amphibians, reptiles, and it went, what, scales, no scales, scales? What the heck's going on? And then I learned much later, one type of scale, no scales, totally different type of scale. Your immune system is a barrier. Those cells and those responses are generated in the dermis and from the blood vessels that go by as well. Coloration is generated from the dermis into the epidermis. In people, is that the color of our skin based on melanin is there as a double protection, is that your production layer of cells are the ones that could potentially go out of control and become carcinogenic. And there is UV frequencies that can cause certain particular types of DNA changes to cause cancerous changes in the dermal cells where this all, or the very bottom of the epidermis, really, where the cells are being generated. So you want to block a lot of that penetration. And you can do that with melanin, with the brown coloration that you see in human skin. Problem is, down in the dermis, there are cells that take a chemical from food and use a photochemical reaction to produce vitamin D. Pretty important calcium regulatory controller coenzyme. And for that, you need a certain amount of light penetration to get down that deep. So our original ancestors who lived in the open grasslands near the equator, they needed the dark skin to protect them from skin cancer. As my ancestors moved into the forests of Europe or across the temperate regions of Asia or into the Americas, the natives who settled in the open plains of the America tend to have fairly dark skin. The ones that wound up all the way down in South America, who are near the equator but in a very dense jungle, their skin lightened up again. So the darkness of the skin is a protection from skin cancer. The lightness of the skin is to allow vitamin D production. We don't need, us pasty Europeans don't need a tremendous amount of light exposure to produce adequate amounts of vitamin D. If you're African American and you're living, in our cold region where not a lot of your skin is exposed, vitamin D can be an issue. Oops, my note's over here. Structure. Skeletal systems are something that muscles can pull on and manipulate. But it's more than, wouldn't consider a clamshell to be a skeletal structure. Yeah, the muscles do close the shell, and there is one hinge on it, but there's a certain amount of complexity you need, a certain amount of articulation before you're looking at a real skeletal system. But there's some part of the skeletal system that is resistance to the muscles. The muscles pull, and because there's resistance in the skeletal system, parts move. And of course, leverage is exerted. In some cases, the resistance is non-rigid. It is bags of water, basically. Hydrostatic skeletons, where like an inflated balloon, it tends to hold a particular shape. Muscles can distort the shape, but it tends to go back to the shape that it was, and then muscles can pull it the other way. Is that in an earthworm, they're donut-shaped, fluid-filled chambers, and when you squeeze them one way, the earthworm gets wider, and it can dig into the sides of the burrow. When you squeeze it the other way, it gets longer, and it can actually push these expanded rings along, peristalsis. The closest we have to a hydrostatic skeleton is that, right? Muscles pull. How do you stick your tongue out when there's nothing out there pulling? What happens is the muscles of our tongue squeeze the tongue and make it get longer. So it's a type of hydrostatic skeleton. But for the most part, we have rigid skeletons. We did talk in the echinoderms about the water vascular system. That's sort of a skeletal system, but generally isn't considered. It's a power system rather than a skeletal system. Rigid skeletons can be on the outside or on the inside. And like a lot of things in the world, the upside of one is reflected in the downside of the other. An exoskeleton, a rigid skeleton on the outside, pretty protective. An endoskeleton, surrounded by all of our soft parts, not terribly protective unless you fiddle with it. This is a pretty protective part of an endoskeleton, but it isn't really, it doesn't manipulate. You've got a whole bunch of bones in your skull. The only ones that are movable is your jaw, the little bones in your ears, and where your skull interacts with the top of your vertebral column. The rest of these are all zipped together because they're there for protection of your soft, squishy brain. You can make the same case for your rib cage as well. But typically, exoskeleton is more protective than an endoskeleton. Flip side is that running the muscles around the inside of the skeleton and around corners and pulling, you lose a little bit less power going around the corners. Whereas with one of these, because of the way you don't want this muscle to go straight here, it needs to be kind of held down as it goes around this corner. It loses a little bit of the pull. So exoskeletons generate a little bit better leverage than endoskeletons. Your whole body's covered with a rigid material. As you get bigger, your surface increases faster than your volume. The weight of that skeleton increases with size to the point where there are size limitations on anything with an exoskeleton. Not quite as bad if you live in the water and you have some buoyancy. Your biggest exoskeleton animals were all aquatic animals, but it limits their potential size. When you put the leverage and the size together, this whole thing about Spider-Man with the proportionate strength of a spider, spiders can lift like 50 times their own weight. Yes, they have slightly better leverage. It turns out that if you double the size of a muscle, you don't double its strength, which means tiny muscles are proportionately stronger than big muscles. And also, a spider don't weigh much. Is that land arthropods, land exoskeleton animals, have had to fiddle with the rigidity of their covering and lighten it up. Whereas our skeleton is somewhat similar structurally to cement, like wall cement. Is that the chitin that covers land arthropods is more similar to fiberglass, which can be very strong and very light, but not quite as rigid as our stuff is. Ours is on the inside. That means that we have much more size potential, especially if we lighten our load with air spaces like you might find in birds and dinosaurs. So the very largest animals are always going to be endoskeleton animals. Another issue. Say you're the most protective parent in the world, and you buy your toddler a suit of armor. Go fit him for the suit of armor. Well, you don't want it snug because he's a growing kid. So you grow to, like you do when you buy him shoes, you buy him bigger. You buy him bigger armor. Why? Because once he's in that, the armor isn't going to grow. That is an issue with an exoskeleton. Once it is solidified, it does not grow. And so the only way for the animal in there to grow is to get out of it, grow very quickly, put a new set of armor around it, and then, well, not grow very quickly, but expand quickly. Because that gives you something you can grow your tissues into. The same way that, you get your 3-year-old, a 5-year-old suit of armor. When they get to be 5, you get them a 7-year-old suit of armor. That gives them 2 years to grow in there. When you look at the growth curves for animals with exoskeletons, is that there's no growth and then there's very quick expansion. They dump off the exoskeleton, which makes them very vulnerable. They take in air or water and expand their size. They secrete a new exoskeleton and let it harden. So boom, and then they don't grow for a while, and boom, and then they don't grow for a while. Is that insects, the most successful group of land animals, other than roundworms, go through 6 steps, because it is very difficult to go through many molds. Molds, what they ecdysis, removal of the old exoskeleton. Endoskeletons can grow relatively smoothly. You just keep adding to it because it's on the inside. Okay, some other stuff. You need to hold the skeleton together. That's done with ligaments that hold joints in proper positions so that they bend the way that they're supposed to bend, but they can still bend. You have tendons that connect the muscles to the skeleton, because muscles themselves are a little fragile to connect to the pulling points. You have places, especially in endoskeletons, where the rigid ends of the bones meet, where they would wear on one another. So you cover them with something smoother, cartilage. You lubricate it with what's called synovial fluid. Sometimes you put little pads in between, as you have in your fingers. That's what pops when you pop your knuckles. Lots of stuff. Metamerism. In a tremendous number of animals, both endoskeleton and exoskeleton, one of the things that's metameric are appendages. Our arms and legs are metameric. Got a single bone with roughly a ball and socket joint, single bone with a ball and socket joint. Somewhat twisty joint in the middle, a little bit more twisty joint in the middle. Two bones down here, two bones down here. A bunch of gliding bones there that gives a lot of articulation, and then long bones, same thing down in your ankles and your feet. So we are serially homologous. When you looked at the crayfish, if you compared properly the chelipeds to the walking legs, you should have noticed they had the same number of joints, is that they're built on the same basic structure. They had pinchers on the ends of the walking legs too, is that it was really just a matter of size and proportion that makes them different, because they are serially homologous. It's not as obvious with the swimmerettes, but the swimmerettes are serially homologous to the legs as well. It turns out the antennules in crustaceans are an adapted type of leg, and you can tell that because they're homologous. Antennas not. Antennas are not built like the walking legs. In chordates, remember you've got the notochord. That is, in primitive chordates, a flexible rod that the muscles can pull against, and it snaps back in a similar fashion to a hydrostatic skeleton, but it's rigid. And in us, that's been replaced by our spinal cord. And the notochord still functions in embryos to tell the spinal cord where to form. We've talked about that before in embryology. It sends chemicals to the surface that cause the plate to form and then roll up. Invertebrates, there's a group of fish called the cartilage fish. Those are the sharks and the rays, and they're cartilage fish because that's what their skeleton is made out of. Why? Because cartilage is not as heavy as bone, and these fish are not neutrally buoyant in the water, is that they will sink. Now, if you live on the bottom, that's not a big problem. So a lot of rays and bottom-dwelling sharks, not a big deal that you have a cartilage skeleton. You do get some calcification, especially in the teeth and the jaws, but bony fish are a much bigger group, a much more diverse group, a much more spread around the world group, and they can get away with having the bone because they have what's called a swim bladder. It is a gas-filled bubble inside the fish. If you've ever cleaned a fish, it's a silvery bubble that you poke in. It's just, air or nitrogen, depending on the fish. And what it does is, so here's a fish 4 feet below the surface. As you go down, the water gets denser, right? The pressure goes up. It can adjust the air in the swim bladder and match its overall buoyancy to the pressure of the water, the density of the water at 4 feet. It just hang there. Doesn't need to swim in order to keep itself going like a shark does. It just hangs there. If it goes deeper, it can let some of the gas out of the swim bladder and adjust its density. And deeper, it can adjust its density for the more dense. And so it's a huge development in fish evolution that reduces a lot of the energy requirements in fish. Okay, we're gonna stop there. I don't know how I got this onto one